truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, August 5th, 2024, the 1,293rd day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you will be invited to the weekly interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. And just before we get started, for anyone who missed it last week, my merch collaboration with Rise Attire is finished. It's up online. You can go find it at cancelcouture.com. COUTURE, cancelcouture.com. And I know some people were having trouble with the link working last week. So if it doesn't work, you can go to riseattireusa.com, riseattireusa.com, and then look for the Rise International tab, Rise INTL. Go to Cancel Code Tour and you will find all the new merch. I'm really pleased with how all the designs turned out and people are really digging it. So go ahead and check that out. And then also, amidst this financial crash that we seem to be having following Trump's appearance at the Bitcoin conference by about, 10 days? And you want to maybe park some money in Bitcoin. I just want to remind everybody that I am a partner with the platform River. You can buy Bitcoin there. And then I believe they have a 7-day waiting period before you are able to pull it off the exchange and into self-custody. So if you're considering getting started, you can do it even for very small amounts. You can just go to partner.river.com/reasonable. And that's my referral link. So you get Bitcoin, you support the show at the same time. I think I've been pretty clear about my reasoning and why I'm pro-Bitcoin. But ultimately, it is your responsibility to educate yourself on it. It's your decision to make. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, just like everybody could be wrong. We are in very, very strange times. I would also say that from my perspective, I like when the Bitcoin price drops because that means I can get more of it for fewer fiat dollars. I don't buy Bitcoin so that I can sell Bitcoin hoping to profit in fiat dollars. I buy Bitcoin to own Bitcoin. And you're welcome to think that's stupid or crazy or whatever. And so we'll get to some of the market stuff in a few minutes. But I said I was traveling last week and I ended up out in California for the wedding of a friend I've known for many years. And I saw a bunch of my old friends there, one of whom is still a pretty mainstream Hollywood liberal, but was waking up a whole lot. And it seemed like it was happening faster. He was at that point where he was essentially realizing that he had been lied to a whole lot and that the Democrats didn't actually express in their actions any of the values that they expressed in their words. And he was particularly upset by the replacement of Joe Biden with Kamala Harris, not because he loves Joe Biden and hates Kamala Harris, but because nobody voted for Kamala Harris. And I think this is a good reminder that for many people, this is primarily an information problem and an epistemology problem. They really do want to support the values that they express. They're just lied to about what supporting those values actually means. And then the conversation is made so toxic with the controlled opposition dynamic on television and on legacy social media and in our popular culture that it becomes extremely difficult for anyone to take a step back and realize that these people who they've labeled as crazy or labeled as the enemy are really just basically like them. And once they realize how thoroughly they've been lied to, they're not even sure who they're supposed to be mad at anymore. My friend even talked about how he thought I was crazy in 2020. We saw each other probably in late 2022. Thought I was still crazy then. He got vaccinated. He voted for Biden. He's been supportive of all these things. Still reads the Washington Post. But he said explicitly, I thought you were crazy back then. I can see you're not crazy now. I have my brother and a bunch of friends who said all these things back then that I thought were conspiracy theories, and it turns out they're not conspiracy theories now. And that's from someone with a very mainstream information diet and pretty powerful incentives not to reach those sorts of conclusions. And like I said, he's a pretty bright guy and he wants to get things right. He wants to make the right decisions for other people. He wants to make the right decisions for the country. And once someone's at that point, it's just easy to say, yeah, I was brainwashed too, man. I spent most of my life believing in these authoritative sources of information, believing that the world operated in certain ways, and believing largely what I was told all of that meant. And it turns out I was totally wrong about all of it. And once I recognized that, I had the opportunity to start learning all of those things over again with a clearer mind and a better thought process and more of a focus on applying a consistent epistemology and attempting at least to apply a consistent morality. And of course, when you do that, you reach a whole new set of conclusions. And it turns out that once you reach that set of conclusions, your life improves immeasurably. And not once did we discuss elections except the fact that they are stolen. And at no point did I attempt to convince him to vote for someone. I didn't attempt to convince him to vote for Republicans. I didn't attempt to convince him to vote for Donald Trump. And if at any point it seemed like that was my motivation, it probably would have been a lot more difficult to connect with him. Even though we've had many long, interesting conversations over the years, including about things like spiritual matters. I once talked to him about the existence or non-existence of ghosts for like 3 hours. But the point is, I was really pleasantly surprised. I think my friend is turning a major corner, and hopefully in his life, it's not just about politics ultimately. There's a lot of spiritual stuff that goes along with it. And I try to consider this stuff from a person with the perspective he had. Because not only did these people think directly that I had lost my mind because I was saying a bunch of things that they thought couldn't possibly be true, all of a sudden this guy that we thought was smart has turned into a conspiracy theorist. But there were also plenty of people who knew me pretty well who were telling other people that I had gone crazy, so it was much easier for everyone to just collectively believe, and it is extremely reassuring to see that people like that are not only able to see through that, but also able to admit it. And it's also worth considering, or maybe remembering, that as confusing as things can become or things can seem from our perspective, like today is just a shit show. Imagine what this must be like for them. They thought the adults would be back in the room. They thought Trump was terrible and incompetent and evil, and now they're watching this. They thought they had a return to decency. They didn't think they were getting illegal aliens and vaccine mandates and world wars and financial crashes and rigged elections. They legitimately don't even know who's running for president on their side. They're telling themselves it's Kamala because that makes it at least feel stable, but they don't actually know. I actually listened to someone in the back of the shuttle bus coming back from the wedding, red-pilling some people in the back of the bus. And these were people in their late 20s, maybe into their 30s, all of them totally open, having a polite back and forth exchange of ideas. No one was offended, except for the people in the row in front of me who were just silently losing their minds for about 30 minutes, muttering to themselves, just speaking their objections to everything that was said, just under their breath, loud enough for the people close by to hear it, but not loud enough to actually engage in the conversation. It was spectacular to behold. And the thing is, at this point, there are major cracks in the wall. A couple more things happen, the whole wall comes down. And once the wall comes down, everybody tries to get on the right side of things because they can finally see the other side of that wall and what it actually looks like over there. Pretty soon, they're all going to be realizing that the polls are fake, the elections are fake, and the news is fake. And after that happens, it's not too long before they realize they're in a small and dwindling minority. So we've talked for many years now about how this seems to be a controlled demolition of the system at large, and that seems to be the plan of both sides. That plan, the Great Reset agenda, that was a plan to wreck everything and then build back better. And what Build Back Better would entail is a complete reset of the global financial system and the introduction of an entirely new way of life, one that would be, to a large extent, directed by the introduction of a central bank digital currency used to guide and restrict people's behavior through social credit scores, the ability to turn a person's money on and off, full location tracking through our phones or various other tracking mechanisms. We were going to have our health information all compiled within the same digital ID that contained everything else, and it was going to track our vaccinations and prohibit us from certain activities if we didn't have the right health status. It was a grand plan for essentially the end of human liberty, the ability to largely control what a society is able to do. And we've seen the gradual implementation of a bunch of those steps over the years. Through rigged and stolen elections, they would keep all of this in place forever. And of course, the global criminal organization would operate as it always does, trafficking humans for slavery and for sex, trafficking weapons, trafficking drugs, selling blackmail and compromise, controlling governments. There are already quite clearly various attempts toward depopulation, knowing that labor could eventually just be replaced by automation and AI. And none of these things are things that people would generally be voting for if they were informed about them. But people who are committed to that old system are essentially voting for all of it because the old system is corrupt and it's being taken apart. And whether you think the taking apart of the old system is for better or for worse, it is being taken apart regardless. It is already irretrievably broken. And it seems to me that upon recognizing that, the point is to direct things in the most positive possible direction, one that heads in the opposite direction of the agenda I just described, which is an agenda towards centralization, amassing power, wealth, and control in one place in the hands of a very few people. I think everyone needs to recognize that that point is coming. A choice is going to have to be made. You head in one direction or the other. And if you're unwilling to decide if you're going to sit back and just wait and see what happens, I think that only makes it easier for the people in power to hold on to that power. I know people feel like they're pretty worn out about all of it and that this stuff shouldn't still be happening. But of course this stuff is happening. Of course this stuff is happening more. This is something we've talked about for a very long time. And it's good to remember in these situations that what is happening is a mass psychological attack on people, on people's minds. It's supposed to be too confusing. It's supposed to be too jarring. It's supposed to be traumatic. It's supposed to make you throw your hands up and say, okay, I've had enough. I can't deal with any of this anymore. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I just want to get the whole thing over with. And I understand that. I really do. But also, if that's how you're feeling, you just got to take a step back and remember that just because we're finding out a whole bunch of things doesn't make those things new. For instance, a lot of people have just found out in the last few years that media is lying to them intentionally. Some people would say they knew it, but they never knew it was this bad. And they think about going back to a time when the TV was only saying true things to everybody. And everybody knew that the journalists were on their side. They were just trying to figure it out and truthfully report what it is they figured out. But of course, that's an illusion too. They made the movie Network in the early 70s. Orwell published 1984 in 1949. None of this stuff is new. People think it's worse now because of the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which made all of the propaganda legal. And so people think it got much worse then. Didn't get much worse then. It just got more legal. They always did whatever they wanted. It's just easier to get away with it now. It seems scarier now that the illusion has dropped away because, we realize what the scale of this thing actually is, all the new things we have to learn, and that feels very destabilizing. It makes us feel very insecure about situations that we took for granted, levels of comfort we had in our lives or thought we had in our lives that we think we might never get back. But the truth is, if you want the real version of any of that stuff, you are better prepared to go get it now, understanding that all that bad information we were fed before was meant to lead us astray. And now we can avoid using that bad information and avoid falling into all of the traps, which is not to say it's easy. It's definitely harder to guide yourself as a sovereign individual than it is to sleepwalk through things and do what you're told. But if that's what you want, that's the old system, run by those same old people. Now, a lot of people that have been following this stuff carefully over the years, and a lot of people who have been watching Badlands Media or listening to this show, many Q followers, many people in the truth community in general, they understand that there is this great reset plan, this plan to wreck everything, including the financial system, and then build back better on their new system if they are able to capture the hearts and minds of enough people and then direct people into their new system. There are parallel systems emerging, but in order for those parallel systems to win out, people have to actually go and choose them. But regardless of how any of that turns out, it's very clear that there is a plan and agenda in place for the global regime, which means if there is a force meant to stop that global regime, and I think all of us believe there is, and as I said in the last episode, I think Trump himself, as a servant of the people and as a tribune of the people, serves as a tool and a weapon to use against that global regime and guide things in a different direction. If there is a plan and that plan is well known and well laid out, it only makes sense that if there is a force intending to counter that, then there must be a plan there too. We have talked many times about these events converging along a timeline, and we have watched as all of these different narrative through lines reach similar points in the development of those narrative through lines at the same time. All of them are converging on some moment, it seems, that is intended to coincide with the fake election of 2024. And again, we can hope for a real election. Right now, there is no reason to believe there will be one. We will either have a fake election or no election at all unless something dramatic changes in the meantime, and of course, I hope it does. But these events are converging on a timeline, and that is not a coincidence. People are still inclined to believe that what they see on television is real, it's happening organically, and it's happening spontaneously. And they hold on to this belief even though they understand that the events are planned in advance to coincide along a timeline to elicit a secondary response by the people. And when you recognize that, you have to stop clinging to the belief that the event is real or that it's organic. It's obvious that if it's planned, it's not spontaneous. It's slightly less obvious, but still should be obvious, that if it's planned, at least some aspects of the event in reality cannot be organic on some level, at least one level. And that's enough to move the event out of the fully organic. And likewise, the fact that these events are planned in order to produce a secondary effect, a response, a reaction by the people upon hearing about the event, and that's why the event is happening and being reported in the first place, then on some level the event is not real. The fact that organic elements add themselves to the event along the way does not outweigh the fact that the events are planned. And if it's easier, think about this like it's a George Floyd riot. There were plenty of people involved in those riots who saw the George Floyd quote-unquote murder on television and really believe that white cops are quote-unquote hunting black men, and they wanted to get out in the streets and pretend that they were saving black lives everywhere. Many people fell into this, but that doesn't mean that the protests or the riots or the looting or anything else that followed was entirely real. That stuff was planned. The media portrayal was planned and the response was planned. In fact, they planned the narrative to elicit the response and corral people into communicating and behaving in certain ways. And of course, now we look back and understand that most of that is obvious. The coroner's report said George Floyd died of a fentanyl overdose. If we accepted that people organically added themselves to the mix in all of the events that followed the George Floyd event, that doesn't make the whole thing real. It doesn't refute the planning. It doesn't refute the organization. It doesn't refute the fully scripted media deployment that followed. The fact that these events are converging along a timeline, that all of these events were expected, that it's clear these events are coordinated on a timeline and that they are planned means that on some level they are not real, organic, or spontaneous, regardless of whether or not there are real, organic, or spontaneous elements involved. And when we understand that, then we should understand that the real, organic, and spontaneous elements are all secondary results of the narrative as intended, and we should be focused on the narrative deployments when it comes to our analysis, how we're going to view situations, and how we should anticipate reacting in the future. Because anything real, organic, and spontaneous will be falsely reported intentionally. The actual details, to the extent that there are any at all, should take secondary priority. And I know that seems weird for people, but to take a step back, just think about how weird it is for us to know that events are partially fake, but analyze them as though they're totally real, when the most important fact in the real situation is that we are being lied to. And if that's not crazy enough for you, it turns out that this is even true for events playing out in real time, and perhaps it's even especially true for those events because those are the times where we're only getting a very limited perspective and viewpoint, and over time, more information is added. Now, as far as the financial stuff goes, we were told to expect a crash. Today, we get reports of a big crash, and we're getting one. And people who have been anticipating a crash, people who have been paying attention to a lot of what's been going on these past few years, things the media doesn't want to talk about, they're trying to figure out what to do just like everyone else is. But a lot of people are still bumping up into these habitual mindsets that are reliant on all of these old systems. People are giving advice based on what their wealthy and well-connected friends are doing. Some people are going with what their financial advisor has said. Some people are going with the very conservative options that have always worked before. Some people are trusting the man on TV. And in all those cases, people are looking for some sort of authority to give them guidance so that if things don't turn out well, we can all place that burden on whoever gave us the advice that we followed, even if that person is a stranger. Now, of course, within that, there is the honest admission that we aren't experts on these things, and we don't know 100% what the right decision is. I certainly don't pretend to know, but I'm also not going to pretend that the man on TV or the way things have always been or financial advisors or rich and well-connected people know what the right answer is either, just because they seem like they must know more than we do. Did they nail it on COVID? Did they nail it on vaccines, mail-in ballots, the stolen election, the big lie, the very violent insurrection, vaccine mandates, Ukraine, Israel, illegal aliens? Are they nailing it right now on what we should do about our fake elections? What important thing have any of those classes of people gotten right over the past few years? Those groups of people are entirely dependent on the old system continuing to function in the same way. And they're doing that in face of everyone agreeing that the old system is collapsing on purpose. It is an almost surefire strategy toward losing, which is why its strongest proponents are people who have not really been touched by all of these concurrent crises playing out at the same time over the past few years. In fact, they've largely benefited from how things have gone. Now, at least the financial advisors have some stake in your decisions, but they're not eating your downside consequences if their decisions don't turn out to be the right ones for you. And no matter what they advise, it ultimately is your decision and not theirs. I made this same argument in discussion about the vaccine mandates. People try to blame getting the vaccine on Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't mandate the vaccine. He didn't threaten your job if you didn't get the vaccine. He didn't make anyone's decisions for them. People made their own decisions. And if you made the decision to participate in a medical experiment because Donald Trump said it might be a good idea, then that's a very bad rationale for making decisions. And it's also pretty dishonest because Donald Trump gave us plenty of reasons not to take it. And I haven't met a single person yet who honestly says that that was their number one priority in decision making. They wanted to be able to travel. They didn't want any trouble at their jobs. They wanted to keep doing things in the world in spite of the threats to restrict their access. At the end of the day, we can blame other people for our decisions, but that doesn't undo the decision, even if we're placing blame accurately. And think about what we're dealing with here. With the rich, well-connected people, the financial advisors, the way things have always been done before, the people on television. None of them have dealt with what's happening. Most of them don't have a clue anything is really happening. These people are nearly all pot invested in the old system to the maximum degree, and all of them are going to give advice that covers their asses and minimizes their chances of being blamed. And usually what that entails is going with whatever is viewed as the consensus opinion. And so you end up in a logical loop. Consensus is formed by people not wanting to think for themselves, relying on traditional analysis, relying on the experts, so no one can be blamed. They agree with the consensus, which then affirms the consensus opinion and ends with more people promoting that same consensus. And we see it over and over and over as people are wrong about increasingly important issues in their lives. And it's a matter of when we get off that train. A lot of people in our community got off in 2020. Many got off before. There are some people who have gotten off since. But it's entirely possible for people to understand that you can't trust the experts when they say wear 2 masks, a decision that's important and has some consequences, but it's not like, what do I do with my life savings? And it's because the decisions are increasingly more important that it's even harder not to go those more traditional routes so that we can delegate the responsibility for our decisions, which gives us someone other than ourselves to blame. The chances of the people who've been wrong about almost everything that matters being right about this thing that matters a lot are very slim. The point is to take the time and do what we can to learn as much as we can when we have important decisions on the horizon. That's when we should be extra diligent, not extra inclined to depend on authority this time. And to be clear, I'm not saying that no financial advisor will be right. I'm sure there are financial advisors out there giving people good advice because they're smart and they're conscientious and they want their clients to do really well. But if your financial advisor believes that polls show Kamala Harris has a real chance of winning this thing, then that sort of standard issue villager nonsense should clue you in to the fact that your financial advisor doesn't know what the hell he's talking about and probably does not have keen insight on the world ahead. People are inclined to follow consensus because it gives them plausible deniability. They have delegated and diluted their responsibility. They can blame someone else, and it won't come back on them. And in following the consensus, they affirm the consensus and suggest that other people follow that consensus as well. And that's all the same feedback loop and circular logic that had everybody getting vaccinated because how bad could it be? They've always been so good in the past. It is entirely possible for the overwhelming majority of people to be wrong about very important things. We have seen it happen over and over and over again. But we are in something different. We are in something new. It is our responsibility to guide ourselves through these things the best we are able, because no one's going to do it. And the truth is, if you're ahead of the game, then the incentives for hard work right now are higher than they could ever possibly be. So let's keep in mind that self-enforcing aspect of the central narrative bubble and how consensus affirms and begets more consensus, and the circular reasoning that tells people everyone can't be wrong instead of doing the work themselves, assuming that other people among everyone must have done that work as they include themselves with that everyone and add in one more person that can't be wrong, even though all that person has done is choose to delegate his own thinking. And I want to discuss this from The Economist yesterday. The headline, "The Middle East braces for wider war as Iran weighs its response." The subheadline, "After Israel strikes, America is rushing troops to the region and airlines are steering clear." And I want to go through a little bit of this just for some background. For a few hours over the weekend, Israelis could enjoy an illusion of normalcy as they watched their athletes in the Paris Olympics win 3 medals in a single day. Then they went back to scanning the headlines as more foreign airlines canceled flights to the country for fear of imminent conflict between Israel and Iran. It seems all but inevitable that Iran will respond to a pair of Israeli assassinations carried out last month. On the night of July 30th, an Israeli strike in Beirut killed Faoud Shakur, a senior commander of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia and political party. A few hours later, another strike assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist group. And that's amazing. Only 10 months after the paragliding go-kart incident, and finally it has been avenged with these two people after, avenging it in other ways for the last 10 months. Haniyeh was killed in a government guest house in Tehran just hours after he attended the inauguration of Iran's new president. And of course, Iran's new president, in quotes, is only there because it seems that there was an assassination of Iran's old president. That makes his killing impossible for Iran to ignore. In April, after Israel assassinated an Iranian general in an airstrike on his country's embassy compound in Damascus, Iran responded with a salvo of over 300 missiles and drones. And we talked about that at length. Like all previous major Israel-related incidents, it happened on a Saturday. We were told it was happening, and then we waited hours to find out exactly what was happening And then we never really found out. We were told that the Iron Dome just basically took care of it all. And then Israel had to strike back at Iran in order to save face. And I did a whole episode on that if you want to go back and get the whole argument. But again, these are events that should be analyzed first and foremost as narrative deployments looking to cause a reaction, to the point where the reaction is actually the purpose of the initial event and its reporting. After decades of using proxy militias to harass Israel, Iran set a new precedent. A direct attack on its territory would be answered in kind. How it will answer, however, is impossible to predict. The first question is timing. In April, it took Iran 2 weeks to retaliate. It wants to keep the Israelis on edge, yet does not want to be seen as dithering. Another question is whether Iran will target only Israeli military bases, as it did in April, or attempt to hit a civilian target. And think about that. They are describing military events in a narrative sense. They want to keep the Israelis on edge, yet they do not want to be seen as dithering. Ah, yes, those are surely their primary concerns. Then there is what Israeli intelligence analysts call, quote unquote, the blend. Will the attack come solely from Iran, or will Hezbollah and perhaps other members of Iran's Shia coalition, such as the Houthis in Yemen, fire as well? Since October, Israel has taken fire from all directions, but Iran's proxies have yet to unleash their full arsenals. Hezbollah, for example, has used mainly short-range rockets in its near-daily attacks on Israel. It could launch some of its larger missiles to avenge Shakur. America has considerable forces in the region, including an aircraft carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf and a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the Eastern Mediterranean. A squadron of F-22 stealth fighters is being rushed in. General Michael Kurilla, the head of America's Central Command, has also arrived in the region. As it did in April, America is working with its Western and Arab allies to set up a defensive screen. Together with Israel's own missile defense capabilities, they hope to intercept most of the Iranian projectiles. Indeed, Iran itself may be waiting for this screen to be in place. That would allow them to retaliate against Israel, but contain the potential fallout. And to be clear, what they just described would be another face-saving event. Iran is waiting for the defenses to get in place so that whatever they fire can be intercepted in order not to create a bigger problem? Iran and Hezbollah are not looking for all-out war. August 4th is the anniversary of the devastating explosion at Beirut's port in 2020, which killed more than 200 people and wrecked much of the city center. The blast was caused by a stockpile of ammonium nitrate at the port, and many Lebanese suspect Hezbollah had a hand in storing it there. The group is wary of inviting more destruction on the city, and you have to love that they are simultaneously framing that as a threat and something that just happened because some chemical compound was in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are voices calling for moderation in Tehran as well. Youssef Pezeshkian, son of the newly inaugurated president, wrote on his website that war with Israel is not a priority for Iran. Rather, it should wage war on, quote, poverty, corruption, discrimination, inequality, and wasteful political factions. And the article goes on. But let's refocus on the headline and subheadline for just a second. The headline is, the Middle East braces for wider war as Iran weighs its response. And then, after Israeli strikes, America is rushing troops to the region and airlines are steering clear. And so we got reports over the last few days that 4,000 American troops were being redirected to the region. Reuters told us on Saturday that they'd be deploying more warships and fighter jets and to deploy more land-based ballistic missile defenses. Among other countries, the United States has encouraged its citizens who are in Lebanon to leave. And as the Economist article mentions, there are flights to and from Beirut being redirected. There were reports over the weekend that the pizza shops that service the Pentagon were especially busy. meant to indicate that the people working at the Pentagon were burning the midnight oil. They were all going to be there around the clock to deal with this very, very dangerous situation over in the Middle East, where Iran is determined to attack Israel in response for Israel assassinating various leaders. But also, apparently, they're going to wait until the defenses are ready before they attack because they don't want a big thing. The article says Iran and Hezbollah are not looking for all-out war, but they do need to save face. And the initial indications were that this was going to happen on Saturday, and then we heard that it was going to happen today, and now people are kind of expecting that it's going to happen on Thursday. You know, whenever the timing is right, however the story demands. And yes, they're at war, but they're also allowing the other side to put their defenses in place so that we can keep it to, not too much war. Like a little bit of war, but not a lot of war. And sure, it's planned out and they're seeding narratives to help people frame and understand what they're told later. But it's going to be reported as fully real, fully organic, and totally spontaneous, and we will have to understand it that way and then react accordingly. Now, we're not experts on these sorts of things, so we can't figure them out. We're going to have to listen to the people on TV, the experts, the powerful and wealthy people who surely know more about this than we do, and we're going to have to assume that ultimately it's going to go the way all these things have gone in the past. But I want to focus on all these various attempts at narrative seeding. We're told troops are being redirected. We're told equipment is being sent over. We're told people on the ground are being asked to leave. We're told flights are being redirected. And we were told that pizza orders were temporarily increased. Are pizzas still at an all-time high? Are pizzas just being cranked out and sent to the Pentagon 24 hours a day? We know Iran wants to strike, but they also want to keep Israel on edge without seeming like they're dithering. And the truth of it is that every bit of this could be a product of complete and total fiction, because each one of those little story aspects is being used to support the idea that war is at hand. It could happen any moment. And if we accept all of that, then when we are told the war has begun, we will think, oh yeah, of course the war began. We were told the war was about to happen. And we will immediately believe we saw it coming the whole time based on these events that we were told meant war was about to happen. And at the end of the day, all of those little events, those little narrative seeding deployments, could have been made up and reported to elicit that exact response. It's entirely possible that none of the elements are true, but because they all conform to the pattern that we were told to expect, we take it to mean that the cause and effect relationship is real and that all of those events are true. I posted about this on Telegram and Truth Social today, trying to lay out the logical form of it. So here's what the narrative has been telling us. They're giving us what's known in formal logic as a conditional statement, an if-then statement. If the pizza shops around the Pentagon are super busy, that means that war is coming. If flights are redirected, that means that war is coming. If troops have been redirected, that means that war is coming. So basically just a conditional claim about each one of those where the conclusion is war is coming. If X, then Y. If A, then Y. If B, then Y. If C, then Y. We're being told a series of events is occurring, and the implication in every one of those events is that war is at hand. Then when we are told that war is at hand, we will immediately believe it because we've been conditioned to expect it, and we will believe that it was caused by everything we've been told, when no part of that is actually required to be true. And let's stick with this story for a bit. This is from Haaretz today. Haaretz is a left-leaning, regime-oriented Zionist news outlet. That's not a conspiracy theory. They've always been left-leaning. They've always been Zionist. And if it's possible to be both of those things without supporting the global regime, I have no idea how. But their headline today is, Iran's looming threat will challenge Israel more than Tehran's previous attack. Well, that's amazing. War is at hand, and they already know how the war is going to go. The United States is still signaling that it will stand behind Israel if Iran and Hezbollah carry out their threats to avenge 2 recent assassinations. Despite the bad blood between them, the last conversation between U.S. President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu included an American promise to help Israel defend itself from the expected missile and drone attacks. Now, Joe Biden's not a real president. Joe Biden did not receive 81 million real lawful American votes. He was not properly certified. He was not properly inaugurated. At no time during the past 3.5 years has it seemed like Joe Biden actually commands the power of the United States presidency as we have ever known it in our lives. And no one within the fake administration has ever, at any point, seemed like they actually knew what was going on in the world to any better extent than the mainstream media did, which is what you would expect when the mainstream media is an arm of the global regime's intelligence apparatus and regime-oriented governments are just the puppets and the mouthpieces of the same regime's same intelligence apparatus. Joe Biden is not making decisions or stating definite American policy to Benjamin Netanyahu, and the chances that Benjamin Netanyahu believes Joe Biden is actually a president with the ability to do that are probably zero. The Americans are beefing up their forces in the Middle East, and on Monday, General Michael Kurilla, commander of the U.S. Military Central Command, is supposed to arrive in Israel to coordinate the preparations. It sounds like they're trying to plan a surprise party with the person whose birthday it is, who's determined to have people throw them a surprise party. Defense officials don't expect Iran, Hezbollah, and other organizations in the Iranian-led axis to backtrack on their threats of revenge. They predict that the attacks will happen soon and focus on military and defense facilities in northern and central Israel. The intelligence assessment that Iran and Hezbollah aren't currently interested in an all-out regional war remains unchanged. But the fear is that an exchange of blows between the sides, Iranian attack, Israeli response, rinse and repeat, will lead to an escalation that will be hard to stop. Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah has threatened several times recently to attack Tel Aviv if Israel attacks Beirut. It's hard to see him backtracking on this now. But Hezbollah may be leery of attacking strategic Israeli infrastructure like the natural gas rigs in the Mediterranean Sea. Lebanon's energy infrastructure is very vulnerable to attack, and Hezbollah knows Israel could shut down Lebanon's power systems for a long time with relatively simple airstrikes. The last time around, in April, Hezbollah refrained from joining Iran's attack. This time, Hezbollah has threatened to participate, as have the Houthis in Yemen. This means Israel faces possible attacks from every direction, with some of the fire coming from Lebanon, which is not only nearby, but has a huge quantity of missiles, rockets, and drones, some of them precision weapons. Consequently, Israel's aerial defense system will face a tougher challenge than it did in April. Despite the vocal threats by official Israeli spokespeople, the Israeli response will clearly depend partly on the success of Iran's attack. Massive destruction, and especially casualties, would likely result in a harsh Israeli response. In April, Israel made do with a pinpoint airstrike on an Iranian defense facility, and it was later reported that this attack destroyed an essential component of an S-300 battery. The S-300 is the aerial defense system that protects Iran's nuclear facilities. So basically, if Iran carries out the exact attack that they are citing in this article, but it happens just a little too hard and a little too successfully, which means that everyone really, really believes it, well, then Israel would be justified and able to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, and then all of a sudden we have a quote-unquote nuclear war. And if all of this is beginning to sound familiar, it's because we got essentially all of these same stories in the Russia-Ukraine debacle. The global regime wants a massive war, so we are getting stories that lead us up to believe there could be a massive war. All of these small narrative deployments, they're obviously seeding a future event. When we are told the future event has come, we will be inclined to confirm every aspect of this as true, even though none of them have to be. And then we will be more inclined to believe whatever future narrative deployments are layered on top of this. And how about this one? This is from Axios yesterday. The headline is Scoop. Blinken told G7 Iran and Hezbollah could attack Israel in the next 24 hours. And the Axios website is convenient because right above that it says 22 hours ago. And so far it hasn't happened. Secretary of State Tony Blinken told his counterparts from G7 countries on Sunday that an attack by Iran and Hezbollah against Israel could start as early as Monday. 3 sources briefed on the call tell Axios. Blinken convened the conference call to coordinate with close U.S. allies and try to generate last-minute diplomatic pressure on Iran and Hezbollah to minimize their retaliation as much as possible. He stressed that limiting the impact of their strikes is the best chance to prevent all-out war, something that, again, they've been gunning for in various parts of the world for years now. They're not trying to prevent all-out war. They're trying to create all-out war in the narrative sense, if not in reality. Iran and its Lebanese ally Hezbollah have vowed to respond to the assassinations by Israel of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Hezbollah military commander Fuad Shukr in Beirut. The sources said Blinken stressed that the U.S. believes Iran and Hezbollah will both retaliate. But unlike the Iranian attack against Israel on April 13th, in which Iran launched nearly 350 attack drones and missiles toward Israel, and Israel, the U.S., and their allies worked together to intercept most of them, Blinken said it's unclear what form the retaliation will take. Blinken said the U.S. doesn't know the exact timing of the attacks, but stressed it could start as early as the next 24 to 48 hours, meaning as early as Monday, the sources said. And it's funny that they keep telling us it's imminent every couple of days. Because again, if they don't actually know what's going to happen, and they don't know when it's going to happen, but they do know that they need to portray themselves as prepared and in control, then they need to just keep suggesting the thing is going to happen. And as that process continues, and the anticipation is built up, then the tendency to over-dramatize anything that does happen will be increased as well, which will mean the anticipation and the expectations produced will not ultimately be satisfied, and that impact will only be increased as they try to overstate their case. And again, we saw this over and over with Vladimir Putin's very brutal invasion of Ukraine. Axios says Blinken asked the other foreign ministers to apply diplomatic pressure on Iran, Hezbollah, and Israel to maintain maximum restraint. Blinken told the G7 foreign ministers that the boosting of U.S. forces in the region was for defensive purposes only. One source who was on the call said Blinken sounded frustrated when he briefed the ministers on recent talks with Israel over a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal. Blinken said the administration felt it was, quote, close to a breakthrough, end quote, before the assassination in Tehran. Now a deal is needed more than ever, Blinken added. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller declined to comment. So secondary sources told us that Blinken said things to other foreign leaders about when this attack will happen, what will happen, and how everyone should respond. Axios notes that the G7 ministers put out a statement saying we express our deep concern over the heightened level of tension in the Middle East, which threatens to ignite a broader conflict in the region. They continued later, we urge all involved parties to refrain from perpetuating the current destructive cycle of retaliatory violence to lower tensions and engage constructively toward de-escalation. No country or nation stands to gain from further escalation in the Middle East. And it would be nice to believe they really think that, but I have a hard time believing they do. Now, we talked last week quite a bit about Nicolas Maduro down in Venezuela and the claims about a fraudulent election and the back and forth all week with Elon Musk. Elon had threatened to use his space lasers against Maduro. He had called him a donkey. He changed the color of his Twitter verification badge, and he agreed to fight Maduro, saying that if he won, Maduro had to resign, and if Maduro won, Elon would send him to Mars for free. Throughout the week, we were waiting to hear how the fake administration would respond. Would they accept Maduro's claim to victory, or would they agree that the election results as reported were a product of fraud? And let's go quickly through Blinken's statement. The United States applauds the Venezuelan people for their participation in the July 28 presidential election despite significant challenges. At least 12 million Venezuelans peacefully went to the polls and exercised one of the most powerful rights given to people in any democracy, the right to vote. Unfortunately, the processing of those votes and the announcement of results by the Maduro-controlled National Electoral Council, the CNE, were deeply flawed, yielding an announced outcome that does not represent the will of the Venezuelan people. Antony Blinken just said, the reported results do not accurately reflect the will and consent of the voters. Isn't that amazing? The CNE's rapid declaration of Nicolas Maduro as the winner of the presidential election came with no supporting evidence. The CNE still has not published disaggregated data or any of the vote tally sheets, despite repeated calls from Venezuelans and the international community to do so. As the independent Carter Center's observation mission reported, the CNE's failure to provide the precinct-level official results, as well as irregularities throughout the process, have stripped the CNE's outcome of any credibility. Again, apply that directly to America's election, and it fits every standard that Blinken has mentioned so far. Meanwhile, the Democratic opposition has published more than 80% of the tally sheets received directly from polling stations throughout Venezuela. Those tally sheets indicate that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia received the most votes in this election by an insurmountable margin. Independent observers have corroborated these facts, and this outcome was also supported by Election Day, exit polls, and quick counts. In the days since the election, we have consulted widely with partners and allies around the world, and while countries have taken different approaches in responding, none have concluded that Nicolas Maduro received the most votes this election. And I don't think that's correct. Given the overwhelming evidence, it is clear to the United States and, most importantly, to the Venezuelan people that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia won the most votes in Venezuela's July 28 presidential election. In addition, the United States rejects Maduro's unsubstantiated allegations against opposition leaders. Maduro and his representatives' threats to arrest opposition leaders, including Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, are an undemocratic attempt to repress political participation and retain power. The safety and security of the democratic opposition leaders and members must be protected. All Venezuelans arrested while peacefully expressing their right to participate in the electoral process or demand transparency in the tabulation and announcement of results should be released immediately. Law enforcement and security forces should not become an instrument of political violence used against citizens exercising their democratic rights. Okay, well, how does that comport to the fake administration's explicitly stated views on the very violent insurrection of January 6th, right here in the good old US of A? We congratulate Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia on his successful campaign. Now is the time for the Venezuelan parties to begin discussions on a respectful, peaceful transition in accordance with Venezuelan electoral law and the wishes of the Venezuelan people. We fully support the process of reestablishing democratic norms in Venezuela and stand ready to consider ways to bolster it jointly with our international partners. So how about that? Antony Blinken, in that statement, just made all the points I've been making for the last 4 years about our elections. That statement can be layered directly on top of what happened in our elections. And the events in Venezuela, and most importantly, the reporting of those events, can be easily seen as a direct parallel to what's happening here, which makes it a template for people to understand better what's happening here and gives all the standard issue villagers and child brains out there who are screaming their heads off about what's happening in Venezuela a logical framework through which to understand our elections if they're able to wake up enough to do that. And otherwise, it's put them all on the record as caring about all of these principles. And so we will see in the future whether they will support them when it comes to ensuring a legitimate outcome in our elections, if we have those. But the fake administration in the United States has officially declared that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia will be recognized as the winner of a different country's election. Isn't that strange? Aren't they a sovereign nation that determines the outcomes of their own elections, or are they subject to the will of the so-called global community? Does our fake administration's fake State Department deciding that someone other than Maduro won mean that someone else is president? When our fake administration is conducting foreign affairs, do they act as though someone other than Maduro is president? Does it mean that someone other than Maduro will control their military or guide their economy or anything at all? And if it doesn't mean any of those things, then what could it possibly mean to declare that someone other than Maduro won? But it's actually a little worse than that, because as we may have discussed last week, Vladimir Putin put out a statement recognizing Maduro as the winner. He said, Russia-Venezuela relations are a strategic partnership. I am confident that your actions as the head of state will further contribute to the steady development of this partnership in all areas. This is fully aligned with the interests of our allied nations and follows the goal of building a more just and democratic world order. I would like to reaffirm our commitment to continue our constructive cooperation on important bilateral and international matters. Please remember that you are always a welcome guest on Russian soil. So think about what we have here. Two world superpowers disagreeing about who the president of another resource-rich, powerful country actually is. One country recognizes one man as president. The other country recognizes his opponent. Whose opinion actually matters? Probably the powerful country with the powerful allies and not the country with an illegitimate and feckless government and weak countries for allies. And I wrote about this on Telegram and Truth Social as well. If Putin can disagree with the regime about who the president of Venezuela is, can he also disagree with the regime about who the president of the United States is? You think Putin knows who the president is, or do you think he believes CNN when they say it's Joe Biden? Whose opinion actually matters? Do the leaders in those other countries, particularly the powerful countries who are allied with Russia, know who the real president of the United States is? I would bet that they do. I would bet they always have. There's no way in the world leaders of foreign nations believe Joe Biden actually received 81 million real lawful American votes. We are told by the system that the system has reached consensus and that Joe Biden is the real American president. And because people have a hard time thinking for themselves, they have a hard time putting faith in their own thoughts, no matter how compelling those thoughts are, they will eventually delegate their thinking to other people, sources of authority, experts, the men on TV, rich and powerful people whose interests are directly tied to making sure the regime and its system stay in place because everything they've ever built depends on that system. We are told this follows convention. This is the conventional thinking. This is the way things have always been done before. And so if it turns out that they're wrong, at least they're all wrong together and things stay roughly equal. People don't believe it's possible that all of the characters on American television and in American media, all of the experts, all of the rich and powerful people tied to the regime could all be wrong about something important, while at the same time understanding that there's another set of people, in fact, a larger set of people with potentially better access to information, just as many rich and powerful people, in fact, the leaders of other rich and powerful countries, could disagree with all that conventional knowledge. It's actually entirely possible for Putin and Xi and Mohammed bin Salman and Viktor Orban and some of these other world leaders to be exactly right, and all of the people in our so-called expert class, elites, wannabe elites, etc., to be wrong. And at this point, having watched them be wrong about virtually everything, why would anyone even doubt that they're wrong? And then you can actually separate one step further from that and understand that even if Putin and Xi and the leaders of all the BRICS plus nations, which will soon include Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela, even if they're all wrong, we are still ultimately in a might makes right system when it comes to geopolitics in 2024. The percentage of the world's population and the world's economy involved in that system rather than the regime system continues to grow. And now they're talking about doing these transactions in cryptocurrencies. Putin announced that last week. So do we really need to pretend that the consensus is correct when the same information flow and the same circular reasoning that informs that consensus and preserves that consensus seems to be repeatedly wrong about absolutely everything and has virtually no clue what's happening? And it's not like they just blow it on the important stuff. They blow it on almost all the small stuff as well. Last week, they freaked out because Donald Trump questioned Kamala Harris's racial identity. Well, that freak out has passed, and now most people agree that Donald Trump was correct. On Friday, we got a ridiculous video from Kyle Rittenhouse saying that because of Donald Trump's ban on bump stocks following the as yet unresolved Las Vegas massacre, the greatest shooting in American history, he was not going to vote for Donald Trump. Kyle Rittenhouse, despite pledging his loyalty to Donald Trump forever a year or so ago, said that he's actually going to write in Ron Paul's name because he's a better protector of the Second Amendment. Now, again, and as always, as a narrative deployment, that's just fine. Deal the cards, we'll play them. But the actual substance of what he said is absurd. If we had real elections where these sorts of statements actually mattered, he would be, in essence, supporting Kamala Harris. But that didn't matter to the people who believe the most in the legitimacy of our elections, all of those people in Conservative Incorporated who have convinced themselves and enough of the standard issue villagers who listen to them that the best way to support Donald Trump is to nitpick him all the time in agreement with their friends on the left who they portray as their enemies, even though they are actually their friends and their partners in the controlled opposition dynamic. They all used the exact same argument Kyle Rittenhouse made while they were supporting Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley in the primary, pretending that those two candidates would be better for the Second Amendment than Donald Trump would be based on that whole bump stock thing. So as soon as Kyle Rittenhouse released his video statement, they all immediately got on his side and began their normal cycle of Trump bashing. Trump was bad for the Second Amendment. And what they are doing by doing that is just straight up overtly supporting Kamala Harris. And why are they doing this? Well, because they believe that a Donald Trump loss would mean that they get to be back in power. Their argument is that Donald Trump is dumb. His supporters are dumb. None of them know what they're doing. None of them know how to win. And the ultimate proof of that will be when they are told Donald Trump didn't win. That will be one of the happiest moments of their life. They will immediately go into telling us all how it was our fault, and had we only listened to the people in the Republican establishment, Donald Trump would have won. And now we're going to have 4 years of Kamala Harris or whoever the Democrats decide to place in that position over the course of the next few months as things continue to play out. There is a reason that nearly 4 years later, they are still ignoring the reality of our stolen elections. Even those among them who admit that our elections are occasionally stolen just focus on the Trump election. They find ways to blame Trump for not fighting hard enough, for not winning despite the steal. And then they point to winners among the GOP establishment candidates in other rigged and stolen elections that just happen to be rigged and stolen on behalf of establishment Republicans and not on behalf of Trump and MAGA, as the proof that their way is the better way, despite no one, including their own voters, believing that. It is a media concoction supported by consensus. It is common knowledge about the way things have always been. The TV man agrees, the experts agree, and the rich and powerful people who are entirely intertwined and dependent on the system remaining in place agree as well. When Trump loses, they will have proven their case, and they will all be ushered into positions of power and prominence as they have always deserved. Now, all those people seem to like J.D. Vance a whole lot, and it seems like they're very happy that he has been elevated in the national scene by Donald Trump as his running mate in this fake election and fake campaign. We're told that Kamala Harris is about to choose Josh Shapiro as her, quote unquote, vice president, her running mate in this fake campaign. But she also might choose Governor Walz of Minnesota, probably as payback for all of his help with the George Floyd incident and all of the riots back in the summer of 2020. And it's funny because even once that happens, it still won't guarantee that Kamala is even the candidate. Again, it's a fake election. All of these are just narrative moves. People think it's crazy and maybe even disrespectful for some deranged reason that I question J.D. Vance's status just based on the fact that this is a fake election and a fake campaign. But would anyone question the status of Kamala's choice as running mate for the fake election and the fake campaign? Did she go through a real primary? Did she get any votes? Has she served as vice president? Did she win an election? Did she win any delegates in the primary in 2020? Most people have no problem recognizing that everything Kamala Harris is fake, but it's so much easier when we don't like the fake thing. Now, J.D. Vance was on Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo this week, and she asked him about the legitimacy of our elections. This is what he had to say.
Senator, President Trump continues to say that the 2020 election was stolen. He told me that again in this interview. How comfortable are you in terms of the progress being made by the RNC and Republican states that, in fact, we will have a fair election in November?
Well, I think we're making a lot of progress, Maria. I mean, look, Georgia passed a mandatory voter ID law. I think that makes Georgia's elections much more secure. I think that we've got some good court cases, some good legal changes going all across the country. The RNC has been more aggressive about this in 2024 than they have been in 2020. And remember, Maria, the basic principle here is every American citizen's vote should count. But if you're not an American citizen and you're not casting a legal ballot, your vote shouldn't count, right? It's sort of common sense that the Republican Party believes in. And interestingly, the Democrats seem to want illegal aliens to have the right to vote. I think that we've been successful at pushing back against this stuff, but there's still a lot of work to do. But yes, I'm very confident, Maria, 2024 is going to be a better election than 2020. And I think Donald Trump and I are going to win.
So what kind of standard is that? 2024 is going to be a better election than 2020. We've had some changes made around the margins in states like Georgia. Oh, we got voter ID now. That's going to make it harder for illegal aliens to vote. And while I agree that illegal aliens voting is a problem, voter ID is not going to take elections that are not capable of producing legitimate outcomes and turn them into elections that are capable of producing legitimate outcomes. The problems are far deeper than that. Elections are either real and the results are verifiable and the whole process is transparent in as simple a system as possible, or they're not legitimate at all. They can't be mostly legitimate if anyone actually wants a government that governs with the will and consent of the people on behalf of the people. J.D. Vance mentions Georgia. He says he thinks we'll have a better election this year than we had in 2020. And he says he thinks he and Donald Trump will win. And if that's what the narrative calls for, if that's what he was asked to say, well, then great. But otherwise, that's counterproductive. I've said many times, there are two things that we need to have legitimate elections in this country. The first one is a system capable of producing legitimate elections. And the second one is a critical mass of buy-in from the American people. They have to want a new system. The only way they will want a new system is by understanding that the old system is incapable of producing a legitimate result. And right now, that's the status that the old system maintains. It is thoroughly incapable of producing a legitimate result at this point. Now, if that changes over the course of the next 92 days and we can have a legitimate election, that's wonderful. But it's not going to happen as a result of telling everyone that our elections are probably going to be just fine and Donald Trump is going to win. What does that mean for the rest of the federal government? What does that mean for our state governments, our local governments? It doesn't mean anything. That's just a statement in support of the old system. Here's Donald Trump on Saturday in Georgia talking about Georgia Governor Brian Kemp.
And you know what? He's the governor. He ought to support his Republican Party, because if he doesn't have his Republican Party, I could tell you where he came from, and it wasn't good. And you have a great leader of the Republican Party right here. Stand up, please. He has done an unbelievable job. And he has to work like hell with a governor that doesn't help him. And Raffensperger ought to make sure that the vote is honest. And they don't want the vote to be honest. In my opinion, they want us to lose. That's actually my opinion. And we can't let that happen, because if we lose Georgia, we lose the whole thing and our country goes to hell. Because we can't have her be president of the United States. She's grossly incompetent. We can't let that happen.
Now, as with everything, it's entirely possible that Kemp and Raffensperger are just good guys, doing what they're told to do, sacrificing their public reputations for the good of the country and the good of this cause. They played their role in participating in this series of sting operations designed ultimately to create legitimate elections and preserve the integrity of those elections in the future. And they've just dealt with 4 years of being portrayed as the enemy, being portrayed as the villains and the heels. And one day we will look back fondly on them as heroes. But if that's not the case, if we're just going to go with the surface interpretation and what we understand things to be at this point, well, they both participated in the fraudulent election of 2020 in Georgia and the fraudulent elections before and since, both actually just beneficiaries of that system, pretending the whole time that the system is fully legitimate and they are loyal and faithful leaders of the people of Georgia. And that's certainly how they're portrayed in the media, in the Con Inc. media. You can remember after the midterms of 2022, the major argument that Donald Trump and MAGA failed the Republican Party and failed to achieve the red wave that Governor Abbott of Texas, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, and Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia all had these massive victories. The Republicans in their states just loved them so much. Is election fraud fixed in their states? No. Do their states have legitimate elections? There's no reason to believe that they do. It's impossible based on the systems and cannot be supported by the reported outcomes of elections. Trump is being honest. He's saying the right things. He's telling people what they need to know. And the response from Con Inc. media is exactly what you would expect. Here's how Fox News portrayed it.
So you're going to hear a lot about how this rally was received. This is the same venue that the vice president campaigned in on Tuesday. It was a sold-out crowd. Every seat was taken. People did filter out as the event went late. He did start about an hour and a half, or about an hour, 15 minutes late. But Alicia, I can't underscore enough what was so bizarre to me as somebody who was once a Georgia resident and has covered Trump for 8 years now, that he would do multiple attacks against the Republican establishment of the state, including the sitting governor, who's considered very popular. No matter what, that's going to be a major headline coming out of Atlanta. Alicia?
I think there are going to be multiple headlines coming out of Atlanta tonight. Mark Meredith.
So Trump held a rally in Atlanta, same venue where Kamala held a rally just last week, featuring Megan Thee Stallion, a female rapper who screamed her gross and retarded lyrics and twerked on stage at a presidential campaign event. There are reports of her campaign paying homeless people to attend that event to make it look full. Donald Trump packed out the arena just like he always does. Trump said quite clearly that Kemp and Raffensperger want Trump to lose in Georgia. So what does it mean that the conservative establishment is on Kemp and Raffensperger's side on all of this? And of course, they're blaming Trump for this too, and they're saying it's only out of their concern. All they care about is winning. They're not trying to be anti-Trump as they nitpick him to death on behalf of his opponents, agreeing with all of their arguments. They're just trying to win. They're the ones who know how to win, despite having never won and having given the country away in partnership with their controlled opposition, who they pretend are their opponents. Over decades now, Donald Trump shouldn't start drama with those Georgia Republicans. He needs all of them on his side in order to win a fake election. And the TV is telling everybody to care. You should care a lot about this. You should get mad at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is out there insulting all of these people that he needs to win. Except unlike all these child brains gathered around the intellectual kids table on Twitter, advising Trump for the last 9 years while being wrong about everything, Trump knows that he doesn't actually need them to win. Trump already won in 2020 and has only grown more powerful and more popular since then. And beyond that, with everything that happens, he grows more powerful and more popular still, even among people who have hated him for the entire time. But people aren't willing to accept that as true. and act on that reality, because it's easier just to defer to consensus. Because when you do that and you're wrong, well, everyone else was wrong too. And if you're wrong, it was other people's fault. It was the man on TV. It was the experts. It was all the rich and powerful people. And besides, that's how it always was before. It's how it's probably going to be in the future as well. Except the consensus is continually wrong. And it's wrong for the same reason over and over, while it is self-perpetuating and self-affirming. And at some point, people are going to have to decide whether or not they would rather be wrong among company or maybe just be right on their own. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!